Hi, good evening. Thank you for joining us in this, the keynote of a really lovely day of being in communion with people from across the continent and across these great isles. My name is Maxwell Mutanda, and I have the distinct honor of introducing the panel for tonight, in which the preeminent curator, writer, and just all-around amazing cultural figure, Ekow Eshun, is in conversation with the architect Sumayya Vally, who has a position in the school as an honorary professor of practice. We'll be in conversation with our director, Amy Kulper, and currently director of practice, Felicity Atekpe. And I don't think anyone on the stage needs an introduction, but I'm sure that maybe Felicity and Amy may go further. But do feel free to ask questions throughout, but there is time allotted for questions at the end. So please bear that in mind. I will leave you to the stage. And just nod when you need me to change slides.
Thank you.
Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be able to be a part of this conversation with Sumayya and Ekow, and hope to pick up on some of the themes that you were discussing throughout the day around referentiality. So I wanted to start with a question about stories and narratives, which I think is a kind of interesting overlap between the work that the two of you have done. Specifically, I want to ask about the work of myths and fictions that were really prominent in your curation around Afrofuturism and the kind of role that myths and fiction played in anticipating a different future, which I think to me is really interesting in relation to, in your case, Sumayya, let's say the recovery of under-recognized histories and those stories as a way to create accessibility to a larger audience than, let's say, the audience that architects normally are communicating with. And so I wanted to just use that as a way to enter into a conversation around the work that myths, fictions, under-recognized narratives are doing with respect to this larger question of referentiality and some of the threads of that conversation earlier today.
Okay, where to start? Eh?
I know.
Do you want? Okay, fine. I mean, look, we're talking about myth. I curated an exhibition last summer at the Hayward Gallery called In the Black Fantastic, which looked at the way that contemporary artists from the African diaspora are drawing on myth and speculative fiction in their work. And for me, the powerful part about that is probably the part around speculation. It's probably the part around not the fact or the fixity of myth per se, but how it's kind of what Toni Morrison called metaphoric and imagistic storytelling allows us to create new ways of looking and seeing and recognizing and empathizing even. So here, myth is less to do with, I don't know, some of the ways that myth is sometimes constructed as kind of a large system. It's more about the voluntary act of creating, owning histories recognizing there's a subjective way of retelling history that can, let's say this, can put at the center people who historically have been at the margins of stories. Myths are, in the end, they're codified stories. They're calcified stories even. I was interested in the ways that artists draw not literal explication from those, but draw inspiration, catalyzing, fuel in which to take forward the interrogation of the contemporary world and to recognize that we live anyway already within fictions. So just as a simple point to finish with, one of the experiences of, well, I was dealing with artists of color, black artists. We know scientifically that race itself is a fiction, simultaneously it's a lived reality, but one of the, I think, useful things about trading in myth, metaphor, speculation is that overall one comes to an awareness that for people of color we tend to live within the myth system, the fantasy of a white world that posits us as outsider, as alien, as all of these abstract and baroque forms of being. That's our reality. So I find it useful sometimes to find ways to elucidate that, and then also then look at the ways that artists are trying to reach beyond that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think, well, I'm from Johannesburg, and I've said this many times, and I was also talking about it with the students earlier. A big part of the reason that Counterspace was formed as a practice is because I wanted to have a space to pour ideas and love and interests and intents around Johannesburg into. And much of that is a narrative practice, in that it is about being able to find and center stories that are in the city, you know, that come from people's lives, from their mythologies, from their belief systems. I'm really thinking about the things we talked about earlier with the students. We were talking about, for example, the practice of rain calling in South Africa that also happens across culture, and one of the projects that you'll see later also is very much around this idea of a ceremony that calls rain, and the belief that holds for many cultures, that rings true somehow across the Indian Ocean. And being able to see that can be food and fuel for architecture and architectural thinking, for me is incredibly important. I think everything that we see and the power of architecture really is that it makes fiction fact. It makes things that we consider intangible tangible. We were joking about the setup of this lecture hall and the dynamic that it sets up. But even that is someone's ideology of how we should be sitting and what kind of power structure is perpetuated. And being able to see, for example, softer rituals, things that we consider myths, so to speak, or that reach into other realms and other worlds as food for making architecture is really important. I also think there's something about perhaps the power and the intent of speculative fictions from positions of difference, is that architecture as a discipline is so square. It's been so grayscaled. You know, I think the image that I grew up with of what an architect looks like, thankfully I hope it's a lot different now, but you know, always dressed in black as we are. With Isimiaki glasses, and you know, there's a very specific look that an architect has, the kind of pen that you carry, it's so curated. And I think that thinking about things that are that reach into other realms, whether it's camp and kitsch, or whether it is belief systems and mythologies, or whether it's ritual worlds and realms, or magic and the supernatural. Those really have the ability and the opportunity to inject something otherwise into a discipline that's really desperate for it.
Yeah, it's really, it's palpable to me that in both of your answers that the, that explication is the thing that is being moved away from in both of your work, and that the kind of expanse of speculative fiction or heuristic fiction that allows for other possibilities to exist is what's maybe grounding those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose both your answers make me think about whose stories, and in a way finding yourself the story maker, but also part of the story, and where do you sit, how do you sit in that realm. It seems to me an almost too powerful position in some senses, but an also almost not powerful enough position to be able to essentialize references and talk about the every man, but it's the every globe, I suppose, on the one hand, but knowing that as artists, you have a particular gaze, in a sense, that you by nature are curating what brings out. It's a comment, but I'd like to understand perhaps your points of views about that. You know.
I can take turns. I think it is absolutely an incredible power, but also responsibility. And I often do see it as we're sitting in a lineage. We have ancestors, we're on their shoulders. They did work before us, and our work is in a way to continue it. I think also this short-lived idea that we have of success in the profession is, for me, also a fiction. I think, and I hope there are students listening, but I think to aim for success from a career perspective, it's never something that's sat well with me, because I think, you know, there's that saying, what is it? Something like societies flourish when old men plant trees, the fruits of which they will never eat, or the shade under which they will never sit. There's something about that. I think we need to understand fundamentally that when we are here and in service, we're perpetuating something. And if we're not aware of what we're perpetuating, that's also, we're still perpetuating something. If we're learning architecture in a specific ideology, and then we're going out into the world and making that, whether we believe we're evil or we don't, we are perpetuating something. And I do really believe in thinking about figures and references and the kind of lineages that we want to stand in and be a part of. If I think about when I studied architecture, I read a lot of political writings. I read Steve Biko, Thabo Mbeki's I Am an African speech was something that I listened to in the studio all the time. So I think there's something also about connecting ourselves to lineages and recognizing what we're a part of. And I think we have to do that. In terms of responsibility, we have the responsibility to honor those who came before us and the work they did. And we also stand in lineages that have perpetuated very difficult things, and we have to be able to recognize that as well and think about what we're putting forward.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. Think less about power. It's more, yeah, you have an opportunity to, if you curate an exhibition, you have an opportunity to shape space. You have an opportunity to set something down in record. You have an opportunity, therefore, to have a dialogue with these past representations of these artists' work, these considerations of how to use space, and therefore write a new page. Let's put it that way. I tell you, I don't know about anyone else here, but it takes roughly, whatever it is, 2-3 years to do a large exhibition. I don't sleep easy across that time. The anxiety about this lasts from the very beginning all the way through to the opening, because there's a responsibility to do justice to the work and to do justice to the audience that comes. I'm not terribly interested in the ego of it and the power of it. It's much more, can you create a world that is aesthetically and physically and philosophically coherent enough for people to be able to walk through, to recognize that as whole, and hopefully feel that in some way this matters. Not necessarily in grand, consequential ways, but matters enough that we can see the worth of the work, and that we can see through that a way of seeing the world beyond that work, beyond the walls of that space. In modest ways, I'm trying to think about this porosity between the world that we walk in and the world that we make within that space. Sometimes, before I ever curated exhibitions, I was very struck by some of the pomposity that the art world speaks of, that curators indeed carry themselves with. This isn't the thin. The thin is, can you create something that allows people an opportunity to orient themselves in relation to the work, in relation to the world?
It's just an interesting posit, though, because in a sense, you have to be well known enough to be given the opportunity to do it. And there are obviously many interesting people that nobody's ever heard of who have done really interesting things in the world. So there is a point that I think is really interesting about stories, because you need to be sure enough of your story to be able to put it out there and yet be porous enough for other stories to influence that. And I think that's the sort of perpetual tension of the artist in a way. You have to be confident enough to be the person who's saying, well, I have this point of view, I have this story to tell, but at the same time allow other influences. But I think it's good to acknowledge that is the starting point. It doesn't happen without that first thinking, actually, I have something new to say, I want to say it, and then everything flows from that. And I think that's what's perhaps interesting about both your works, because in a way you're trying to disappear so that the work can take precedence, but there is a thing about the work that's curated for both of you that is very particular, I would say, to your experiences, and in fact rightly should be. And I'm just sort of wondering how you wrestle with the idea of then being pluralist and universal enough in that new story so that old stories can join a new, do you know what I mean? Like that, how do you balance that act? Because I find it personally very, very difficult, to be able to be open enough to take the past, allow room for the future, and still provide enough porousness in my thinking that others can join and make new stories. That's, I suppose, what I was trying to get at.
It's your turn.
I mean, look, here's the thing. The thing is, you've got to have a perspective. You've got to have a point of view. This is really, from my perspective, what it comes down to, which is that the role, the task, is to offer a point of view on these things. I can't do everything. I'm not interested in everything. I'm not interested in a universal position. I'm interested firstly, I'm interested in, the things I'm interested in is tautology. But the work I find is, for me, is I try and put a lot of work into, well, why am I interested in this thing? What is behind that? Is it just purely because I like the way something looks and so on and so on and so on? But actually, a lot of the work is trying to interrogate my own position and point of view such that I can validate a choice I make. I can leave space for others to have a point of view on that. I can open up some territory. That's really the goal. But that begins from my being able to say, okay, look, I think this is interesting. I think this is interesting for these reasons and these reasons and these reasons. And the work is to understand your own curiosities enough that you realize they're leading you down to a productive path, which you can then hopefully illuminate for others. Certainly that's how I see it anyway.
Yeah, I think similarly, if I think about some of the earliest projects that I did, they were very, very intuitive, and they were about translating some phenomenon in Johannesburg that I was interested in, whether it was the mythology around the color of the sunset in Johannesburg being very iridescent, and that comes from us having very, very toxic air that is radioactive and full of mine dust. And that intuition around that, if I deconstruct it and think about why I'm curious about that, on the one hand, it talks about conditions of labor and resource and conditions of extraction, and that was very much present in how this particular project folded perspectives. There's also a material interest in being able to recycle something that's toxic and produce something else with it. But there's also this very magical thing that is an experience of being in Johannesburg and wanting to translate that somehow into something spatial or architectural. And if I think about every project from these very, very humble, small, early works, I can see the works that I'm doing now in there. And earlier we talked about, for example, the Biennale project that I worked on in Jeddah, constructing those spaces as atmospheric and as oral, as kind of, vibrating with hue and color and light, came from these intuitions around these early projects. And these intuitions made a methodology that I wasn't aware of at the time. But that's also something I think that we have to somehow be able to be honest and true to an inner sense of purpose, and somehow we have to work at honing that, because that becomes who you are. And often in these academic environments, not this one, thankfully, but systemically in institutions around the world, we're taught to model ourselves in the image of something. And we're not honing those interests. We're working to check boxes about what our work should look like or what things should be. And I think that's very dangerous, because sometimes when we're working from a rigorous place that is about honing intuition, we don't quite know why, but it's very important to be able to do that, because once we do and we have the opportunity to reflect, when we look back, we're able to see that these things meant something, that they came from somewhere, and that they're part of, as you said, a much bigger story.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, not everything is already, the canon is not everything. There are ways of seeing, bodies of knowledge, points of view, histories, myths that lie outside that, which have less status, less perceived value. Part of the task is to go looking rather than remain within, because those already are, or potentially are, these generative places and possibilities.
Thank you.
So that question of the canon, I think, maybe sets up a question that I think is relevant to both of your work, that has to do with the exhibitionist format. Thinking first about the kind of canonical expectations of, say, a biennial, and what does that mean? What are the expectations? What are the boxes that people expect you to tick in an exercise like that? Or a framing of Afrofuturism and what the public's knowledge is of that. And I'm thinking a little bit about both the impetus in exhibitions to render cultural production visible in certain ways for people who don't participate in that, and so to open a kind of window onto how creatives produce work on the one hand, but then the pathology of exhibitionism on the other hand, which I think has been at least a part of architecture culture as long as I have been a part of architecture culture, which has to do with, in some cases, in some venues, a kind of self-centering activity around certain kinds of heroic formal gestures, or a kind of monologic slice of work that is very much not about the shoulders or lineages that work stands upon, but very much about the shoulders that were designing the work. And so I guess I want to position this question around of exhibitions between the really positive cultural work that they do in terms of sharing cultural knowledge, and opening new narratives, extra canonical narratives, and making them available on the one hand, and this pathology of exhibitionism on the other, that has a kind of, the title of this this event that Maxwell and Edward and Guang Yu put together is prominently decentering is in the title, and I think that somehow this question of exhibitions and exhibitionisms, I just wonder if you could maybe unpack it through either your in the Black Fantastic or the National Portrait Gallery work, and maybe through the Islamic Biennale, and just to look at what it meant for it to be the first one, and how you positioned between those disparate influences.
And then we've got to start with the Biennale, because that's such an amazing endeavor. Like, seriously.
Yeah, I don't know where to start, because it was such a, I think thinking about the pathology of exhibitions, this was really stepping into one where everybody has an opinion. It's titled the Islamic Arts Biennale, and it was the first one. And I think when I stepped into it, I had this awareness that I am stepping into a very well-known, well-worn, well-trodden canon, on the one hand, and something that every academic working in a museum has an opinion on. And on the other hand, also a topic that in one facet of my community, or how I identify, everybody and everybody's mom has an opinion on. And from both of those lenses, I certainly did feel an immense sense of responsibility and pressure. But I took the project on, I think, precisely because of that. I never imagined in my own work that I would have the opportunity to meaningfully engage with that part of my identity with, at scale. But also because the canon around Islamic art that we've inherited is colonial. It comes from 17th century France, and when someone says Islamic art, everybody automatically has in their mind images. If I say it now, I'm sure many people are thinking about domes and arabesques and calligraphy, and those are all incredibly important art forms, but they didn't necessarily come from the Prophet, so to speak, or from the beginnings of Islam. And I wanted to think about how to make manifest that the rituals and the lives that we have, the philosophies that we grew up in, or even people who perhaps are not practicing but somehow have a relation to the Islamic world, or if we think about Africa and one in two Africans being Muslim, for example, that there's a resonance and a relevance with parts of culture where people have overlapped. And I really wanted to think about the Biennale in those terms. And from that perspective, it's this huge opportunity, speaking about what an exhibition can do, to really make a new definition for something, or to think about this as a contribution somehow to canon. And from that perspective, I absolutely believe in the importance of exhibitions and biennales as platforms. But at the same time, knowing what I was up against, and also some of the responses that I had along the way, I think if, I wasn't lucky, or the project wasn't pushed through, it could have also just become a platform to perpetuate the same old. And sometimes exhibitions, biennales, etc., do become just that. So we have to think about them as platforms for making the future, and we have to take that absolutely seriously.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'd agree entirely with that. There's a show that I'm working on, an exhibition that I'm working on for the National Portrait Gallery for next February, and it's a group show on black figuration. Its starting point, as it were, is that there's a whole body of work from painters chiefly, who are making incredible work, incredible figurative work. Talk about Kerry James Marshall, or Amy Sherald, or Henry Taylor, or Lubaina Hamid, or Barbara Walker, a whole range of figures. They're all in the show. The challenge with the show is that, to some extent, figuration is a very familiar territory. Everyone recognises the physical form and body. And historically, the ways that black figures have been represented and depicted in art, until, roughly speaking, until the 20th century, these were almost entirely within the hands of European white artists. The aim with my show is not to provide a kind of corrective to the canon, as it were, but to hopefully encourage another way of looking at existing contemporary works. So, on one level, this is a show. It will bring together a wide body of works. We'll have lots of images of the black body, black figure. To some extent, we could say, okay, yeah, that's great. But that's not really the point, because I'm interested in what those artists themselves are doing. Those artists don't give themselves a clap on the back just for depicting the black form. What they're doing, I would suggest, is a conceptual exercise, which is thinking afresh about how we might picture this fictional space, fictional spaces of race, blackness, being, socially constructed spaces. And therefore, what does it mean to make anew, to think anew about those forms and those figures? I'm interested, therefore, in a show that begins with a sense of that conceptual construction and offers an opportunity for visitors to come into that space and not simply look at the black figure, but not simply to look objectively, but to look subjectively at the black figure through the eyes of those artists or the subjects within
their paintings and drawings. That's the shift. And the opportunity with these things is, what's the tension? What's the dynamic? What do we do that's not simply about reproducing the known world, but offering us a further route of inquiry into the tensions and contradictions and paradoxes of that world, so that we can see that richer, so we can understand it stranger, so we can find a way actually to possibility within that. And I think that's one of the potential places one can go with an exhibition or a biennale. We're not remaking, we're not offering a mirror to the world. We're offering, yes, a route to seeing, to discovery, to questioning, an inquiry. That's the potential.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful to think about both of your work in terms of the kind of making the future on the one hand, and picturing the fictional spaces of race on the other hand, which it kind of reminds me of the last conversation that you were in here around in the Black Fantastic, and where you were talking about double consciousness as another kind of construct for that for that work. And I think that's a really interesting way to think in it, and very similar way of thinking about what the opportunities of exhibitions are, which I think is really helpful for this question about that it doesn't make us beholden to referentiality or the referentiality of the exhibition in really interesting ways. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting because with something like that fantastic, you're primed to see the speculative, the strange, the mythic and so on. But actually with figuration, the idea is, well, we're familiar with this territory, we know what it is.
Yeah.
But my contention would be that actually there's still room in here.
Yeah.
And in fact, we only think we know that.
Yeah.
There's actually a whole realm of unknowingness. That's,
It seems to me it talks about an inhabitation of space in a sense, because all your language, both of you, in the Biennale and in what you're talking about, in a way that space enables movement, pausing, reflection, that it would be really interesting to see how, say, you're thinking of the space, because it seems to me, especially that in the Black Fantastic, it's a very curated procession, and how you stop and pause, and the generosities and the restrictions of that space add to how you experience that exhibition. And for you, I mean, I think the scale of the operation and the sort of the outcomes, I mean, some of the pictures are here, are very interesting in space. I think they talk about exhibition in a different kind of space. So it'd be really interesting for you guys to reflect on that, perhaps.
I mean, absolutely. So I did in the Black Fantastic. This is at the Hayward Gallery. The Hayward, I'm sure people are familiar with it. The Hayward is already a fascinating and idiosyncratic space. It's supposed to be, can be challenging and so on, some different levels. There's no straight line through it. So from the beginning, you have to think spatially about that. You have to think about what artworks can do within there, such they're not subsumed within the space. And that, I would suggest, becomes, I felt it became yet more important if we're dealing with the work of Black artists, in that the potential to be subsumed into the space means, to some extent, being subsumed into a narrative, as it were, of European mid-century rationality, progress, all of these things, post-war development, all of these things. What we know from some of those narratives of progress, development, civilization, modernity, is that they work on a binary. So on one level, we can look into the future and see civilization evolving, but the start point for that is inevitably African originated. The start point for those narratives
the other side of the binary is always black underdevelopment. Or there's always a notion that somehow, somewhere, there is a less civilized, and often that's constructed as black, as African, and so on. So the challenge then, with the space where you're dealing with black speculations, is, not just what does the space look like, how do you order within it, but actually how does it feel? How does it feel to walk through that space in relation to those works? How does the space become another component in the exhibition? So there's certain things that we thought about quite hard in terms of space design. We didn't work with the space designer, but we worked with the space. So that means sight lines all the way through it. It means accidental sight lines. It means partial sight lines, as well as what you can see. Also sound, what you can hear bleeding from different parts of the space. Also, I ended up putting up at different interstitial points, I had pieces of text that you'd come across, again, just to keep you moving further into the concept and to build a world through that. So hopefully every tonal, well, not every, but there were a different number of tonalities that existed in conversation with the physical works in themselves. And then anyway, I invited the artists that could to be in the space and come into the space and think about how they wanted their works to be shown within there. So some of them were very actively engaged in that process we can't see, but there was one artist, Lena R.S. Victor, who's a great artist, created you worked through what work she was going to show, but she was engaged enough to think about how the walls in her aspect of the show painted red, but actually they were painted two different shades of red that she chose, marginally different to complement different works and different walls. That kind of deliberation around how do we want to use the space as part of the physical experience of being. It was, foundational to the experience of the work, above and beyond the works in their own right.
So I think there were kind of two scales of sight that I was working with. The one was the sight of Jeddah that, kept coming up in the project as this place, this nexus of hybridity and migration and mixing of cultures, because everybody had passed through it. And somehow it has absorbed cultures from the entire world, but it's also transmitted its culture to everywhere. And it's had an impact on politics, on every aspect of culture that we know, from jazz to food. And that was something that was very present in thinking about the site, that really also worked to conceptualize the project as a whole, and the theme around this edition of the Biennale. But I was also, because it was the first edition, involved in proxy to the process of selecting a site for the Biennale. And we visited several old palaces in Jeddah, but when we came upon the site that is the chosen site for the Biennale, it is the site, the functioning airport terminal site. And so what it is there is the airport terminal where pilgrims land, and across the road there's an unused land parcel, but the entire site is connected with a series of canopies designed by SOM at the end of the 70s. And when we first visited the site, it's kind of this huge landscape of infinite umbrella canopies that are really quite high. They're 30 meters high, and you can see them almost as far as the eye can see. I was flooded with memories of being there as a 14-year-old pilgrim, and really hearing accents and languages from around the world, seeing food from around the world, seeing people leading each other in prayer, and really understanding that this is a gathering of the entire world that is incredibly diverse and yet united in this common purpose. And that energy is something that we really wanted to bring into the project. And so in two parts, the Biennale, on the one hand, in this set of newly constructed galleries, is a kind of internal journey around something that is practiced every day in the faith, the daily prayer. And in those spaces, it's a very, very meditative, very atmospheric experience that moves in scale, from the scale of the vibrational atom, the sound of the call to prayer, to the scale of the infinite gathering, that every time we stand up in prayer, we're connected with people past, present, and future who've done the same. And each gallery takes us through a moment in that experience. It's definitely not a white cube experience. It is highly charged and very subjective. The artists really were also a part of designing the atmosphere. And then in the outdoor section, which is really underneath these canopies, we have very large-scale works. I don't know if we can see some of them. Max, you can maybe go through some of the slides. Okay, as you will.
Do you want me to play the video?
No, you can just go ahead. Don't worry. But the outdoor works are really, each of them is an invitation from the artist for a gathering to happen. So all of them are reflecting on this idea of this place as a nexus of migration, and thinking about how belonging and community is constructed after displacement or after movement, and what are the ingredients of community: food, sound, celebration, work, worship, all these things that bring us together. And it was very, very intentional that each of them becomes not just an artwork to look at, but something to be in. So you'll see later on we have, for example, an artist who created a table that's 50 meters long that then hosted other artists who gathered people around food, for example, lost food heritages in some parts of the world, or the ways that certain species traveled around different countries and through recipes. And that idea was very much also inspired by the site. As loaded as it was, I think it was also very important to see the site as generative and also as tentacular, as reaching to so many different places and having really a place in the hearts and minds and aspirations of so many.
So if you think about it, the strange thing is the white cube space. The strange thing is the space that pretends to neutrality and universality, as if there is only one form of the neutral, the open. That's the strange idea.
But it proliferates and perpetuates, isn't it? It's an interesting space. Because I think ultimately it's the seduction of the everyman, the everyday, the fact that it might talk of an abstracted space that can talk to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, the notion is that this is parity, this is equality, this is where everyone can shine, except that it has its own weight and its own ideology to it anyway.
Yeah, that red room in the Hayward was so powerful because you couldn't enter into it and not think about the white walls and it was so saturated with her work. And well, my next question is a little bit of a departure, but hopefully a welcome one. One of the books that the organizers of the day were referencing, or one of the authors they were referencing, was Tina Compt. And I wanted to, I was just looking through last night one of her books and listening to images, and I found this passage that's about her earlier book, and I want to ask a difficult question about referentiality that I think is related to a phenomenon that she's describing, which is the hum. So I just want to read you the passage first. So she says, I ended my last book, Images Matters, with a childhood memory of my father's quiet hum, the hum of a man mourning the loss of his wife. On the night of my mother's funeral, surrounded by his entire family and all of his friends in our home, my father hummed my mother's favorite Roberta Flack song. swaying back and forth while his 11 and 13-year-old daughters sang over the record. He hummed instead of crying. A hum can signify a multitude of things. A hum can be mournful, it can be presence in absence, or can take the form of a gritty moan in the foreground or a soothing massage in the background. It can celebrate, animate, or accompany. It can also irritate, haunt, grate, or distract. And I was trying to think about this question of referentiality that today's conversations have raised relative to a kind of question of the unsaid or the unarticulated, which I think is often an important part of cultural reference. I am, one of my parents is Sicilian. I am often, when I am up at these things, gesticulating wildly and slapping accidentally the microphone as I go, right? So the gesture, I think, is a part of that. The hum is a part of that. But certain, let's say, sublinguistic ways of communicating that I wonder about relative to both of your works, that both of your design work and curatorial work, that I think often reference things that are more closely related to human practice. And so I just wanted to see if that might be an avenue where we could open up forms of reference that we often don't speak to when we're talking about the canon or expanding the canon.
Well, that's such a beautiful reference. I love that text so much. And as you were reading it, I was thinking about how we honor and how we celebrate and how we mourn, and how that, of course, that is something that connects us as people. But there are also, if we think about it in terms of canon, there are different traditions of honoring. And without wanting to make a binary, perhaps we can say that in an overarching Western canon in space, the way that we honor is to petrify. I mean, Egyptians did it too, but you know, to keep something pristine in a glass box, not to touch it. If we think about how those forms of honoring translate into a museum environment, for example, or into a building, how we really think about heritages and how we preserve them, they're quite static. But if we think about forms of honoring that come from so many other ways of being, they are often a hum. They're oral and they're oral. They're passed down from generation to generation. And we think of those as things that happen inside buildings or around architecture. But those things are not separate. They are also methods for architecture. I often cite, for example, Mali. I tried to think of another example, but I couldn't. But if we think about the mud mosque of Jenne, the way that that's been preserved is really through bodies and through people over generations. And there is a festival that happens the eve before the mudding. People sing, and the elders also pass down this knowledge to the younger generation of how to mud. There is a waiting for the rains to come, so there's also a collaboration with seasons and with the weather. And that's an oral, a lived, an embodied, breathing, ritual practice. And it makes a piece of architecture that is different every year, but arguably has been preserved for hundreds of years. And that, for me, is a very interesting method for architecture. That's one example, but I hope that in my work, perhaps that's something that I aspire to, that I'm really thinking about what are these ways of honoring, forms of honoring bodies of knowledge that come from places of difference that have perhaps been overlooked, and how can they make architecture? Because I think all of them can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great example. I'm glad you used it.
I mean, all of that, both what you're saying, Sumayya, and the passage you read, Amy, that resonates a great deal with me.
Because, yes, so much you're trying to get to is unspoken. I suppose to say two things. One of the strange things about negotiating, as it were, the art world or just kind of public spaces is that there are many, many things that go unsaid, that there are many codes and practices that go unsaid, that go assumed. And it's very difficult to negotiate those spaces. It's very difficult to negotiate those spaces because the languages, the laws, the expectations are so unwritten, but nevertheless are palpable and real. So one version of that, those unspokennesses, is also to do with, to some extent, visual proprieties. Like I noticed this when we're dealing with works of artists of colour often. I had an experience a while ago at Venice a few years ago, and I was watching a film work. It was a moving image work by a significant black artist. It's a 3-screen work. I found it powerfully moving as a work. I remember coming out of it and listening to someone dismiss the work as kind of too fanciful almost. There's too much going on. Mm-hmm. This kind of notion that the appropriate work has an austereness to it, rather than have vulgar extravagance to it. So some of the things that are unspoken assumptions around these things. Another aspect of it comes in, then how do we carry ourselves in these spaces, or how should artists carry themselves, and so on. But what I've realized, one of the ways I've found for myself to get through that, I realized that essentially many of the things I'm interested in, just curating or writing or anything else, come down to what one might call black aliveness. It's a term that Kevin Kwashi uses. But I really like that as an idea because it prioritizes the simple act of being. Mm-hmm. It asks the question, what does it look like and what does it feel like to be black and to be alive, as fully human as one might be, to be recognized and honored for the simple fact of that. So in terms of Tina Camp, that might be recognizing the beauty and the mourning and the sets of history and legacy that go into humming a song. It might mean recognizing and honoring the practice of artists that are no longer with us, and so on. It might mean doing something very simple like painting a wall. These and other aspects are to do with, I would suggest, how we think beyond some of what otherwise might be taken for granted, and understand that aliveness, black aliveness, is to do with honouring, owning, reaching out to the small, the everyday, the quotidian, but sometimes also the beautiful, sometimes also the extravagant, sometimes also the apparent, the ostentatious, and so on and so on and so on. For me, these are sustaining ways of being.
Yeah. Maybe just to follow up, is that okay?
No, absolutely.
Okay. Just to follow up on that, there's something interesting to me about the notion of visual proprieties or the navigation of these cultural expectations of exhibition spaces, and the fact that both of you have used examples that sort of shift registers in the way that Comte does. So she's using images, but she's talking about orality. So that to me seems a really interesting tool to navigate the loaded landscape of referentiality in a way, is to shift registers as a way to not always be kind of misstepping the expectations that are unknown before. us. And to me, that seems really like a lucrative potential territory in this question of reference and how we navigate it. So I don't know if that's a question or comment,
Yeah.
but it does occur to me that was common in across your answers.
I mean, I find it useful, like some of the most useful ways, let's say, of reading artworks, I find are to read poetry, to read Lucille Clifton or Gwendolyn Brooks or whoever, contemporary figures. Because the great thing about poets, successful poets, is they don't work in a linear way. They introduce a curve, they go in different directions, they follow a line of thinking that is emotional and aesthetic, sometimes moral, all of these things, but they don't operate solely on the basis of criticality. I mean, that's obviously in there as well. But it's a useful reminder, I find, of some of the potential richness that lies within works, and therefore some of the ways that one has license to read works, to interrogate works, to show works.
Yeah.
On top of that, you follow a logic that is not strictly analytical.
Yeah.
Again, this is what Tina is doing when, she works to sound, and she finds in that a possibility of reading space and society also.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what that level of poetry does is also open things up for interpretation.
Yeah.
And sometimes, I think, especially when we hear architects talk, there is this tendency to want to over-explain and narrow things down, and talk in very exacting terms about what things mean and where they came from, and what architecture in its essence is actually extremely abstract. And the powerful thing about that is that without us knowing, it affirms and defines us. It tells us something about who we are. Being from South Africa, it tells us something about what we deserve and how we are allowed to move in the world also. And I think the power of that comes from the fact that it's so abstract, that without knowing it, it's doing something to you. And if we think about, sorry, I gave a very negative example, but by the same token, for good and for positive, it can do the same. And so I think sometimes if you over-explain something, the magic is lost. And, if, for example, in South Africa, if we all know why we are segregated and that we deserve more, but our world looks a certain way because of our place in society. When you understand that, then you can also move beyond it, and the magic is, and the unfortunate magic in this instance, is lost. But for better, I think, sorry, I'm speaking so abstractly, but there's something about shifting in medium that is deeply poetic, and there's something in that poetics that shifts us. And if the starting points and the reference points for that come from a place that's deep and meaningful, it will absolutely have resonance also. To your first question, Felicity, across culture and really across grouping somehow.
I mean, I think we're probably getting to the end of this discussion and should open it out. But I suppose one of the things I think why the canon needs to be exploded, as it were, is that it is in the intangible, undefinable, that other things talk better about it, in fact. And other cultures are more attuned, more interested, more able to describe. And so for me, it's the richness that I find, as someone who teaches architecture, it's getting a student to understand that actually it's just a container. The most important thing is all the things that happen in that container or outside that container. But to be able to articulate and better orchestrate and design that thing that happens is the gift of the architect, for better or worse, and I think that's where, for me, it's, as an architect, it's absolutely essential that we get to it, because actually we don't do it well enough, I think. And as Toni Morris says, you know, who knew that the Tower of Babel, maybe if more voices came, we would create something even more magical, right? And that's kind of where I stand on the issue. But I'm very conscious we should allow any burning questions from the floor. Anyone got questions, comments?
I want to repeat back a term that you used, Ekow, which is vulgar extravagance, which just really resonated with me. And I think that the idea of the vulgar is a kind of value judgment that's imposed upon the idea of the common. And one of the things that I think was in common between the two of your work in the exhibition in Jeddah and in the Black Fantastic is the notion of craft, actually. And that's something that is both vulgar in a sense that people participate in that in everyday life, but it's also part of what gives extravagance to everyday life. So I left your exhibition just thinking, oh, I was so hungry for all the things in that exhibition, the color, the rich mix of color, the narrative, the prevalence of storytelling in each one of the artists' work in that exhibition, and then finally just a concentration on craft. And I don't know quite how to frame the question here, but maybe could each of you speak about the centrality of the notion of craft and the participation of the body in the act of making that's so present in the work that you've both shown?
Yeah, just to use one example for that. Thank you for the question. So, the work of Nick Cave. Nick Cave, Chicago-based artist, you know, hasn't really been shown very much at all in Britain. He's an extraordinary artist. Oh yeah, fine. So look, Nick Cave territory up here. So, Nick Cave, he's most known for making these particular works, sound suits. We can see one of them here, the sequined work. Nick Cave has made over 500 of these sound suits. They're all made by hand. They all have at their heart gorgeous extravagance. They're called sound suits because they're made to be worn. You wear them, they make a sound. He stages performances with them sometimes, but clearly he's working within a number of registers. He's working within traditions of craft and decoration that we can see in Mardi Gras in New Orleans, that we can see in Carnival and Mass, that we can see in West African masquerade. We can see all of that here. We can see the uses that craft and textile and costume and decoration are put to, both as a way of summoning history and spirit and people, also as a politics. This is then relevant in Nick Cave's own work because he makes the first of his sound suits after seeing Rodney King beaten in LA in the 1990s, and he's so upset at this sight that he makes his first sound suit as a kind of costume, as an armor, as a resistance to the othering and the violence visited upon the black body. He makes the sound suit as a neutral space, but also as a decisive space and action and form of dress that allows anyone, person of color, person of any gender or sexuality, to occupy physically a space larger than them, to become larger than life, as it were, to become extravagant, to become, yes, joyful, but also pointedly political and sometimes mourning. One of the sound suits in the show was made specifically as in remembrance of George Floyd, for instance. So the works become totemic, they become spectacular. They do all of these things, and and it's absolutely central that they are handmade, that they speak of the body, because the body itself, in these cases, Nick Cave perceives as a body under threat, but a body also with so much richness and potential and vitality that this can also be celebrated at the same time.
I think what Ekow's saying about different registers is so powerful, and I can't speak that articulately to it, but I think I want to agree. But I also so in the Biennale there were historic objects, archaeological finds, and contemporary works threaded into the same experience, and I really wanted to be able to give contemporary practices a lineage by placing them in conversation with historic works, and also historic works a future by having contemporary artists work with them as very active bodies of research from the archive. Thinking about them as generative rather than things that we look at or look upon. And there's something, I think, about seeing that as a valid register for work that is somehow very important, that is also a form of literacy that needs to come into the canon with more force somehow. And that extends also to crafts that are, as Amy was saying, oral or performed or dance-led, so many other ways of being that don't necessarily find easy translation in traditional archive.
I was just thinking, Tim, of Richard Sennett's description of craft and the craftsman, and which is centered around a conversation of tacit knowledge. So it very much belongs to the hum. It's not the part of the tradition of work that gets acknowledged. It's very much the knowledge of the hand that isn't understood in that same way, that I think is also maybe considered vulgar in the framing of your question, right? Not the part that sits in the center of the discipline, but the part that is the undervalued part of the craftsman.
Hi, I enjoyed this book. Yeah. Okay. I enjoyed the discussion on myth and fiction, and perhaps it might be interesting to kind of look at the idea of illusion, perhaps. When you mentioned that success in the profession is also a fiction, I mean, I was drawn to the idea of Maya, in the idea that the world exists as an illusion in some way, and the discourse around, and you spoke about crafts just now, when you spoke about the various aspects on the myth system. It was, for me, the question specifically would be that how would you reflect on the idea of this fictional reality, so to say, in terms of building an argument for an exhibition, for a work of curation, because that's it's unreal to begin with. It's basically it collects a range of works. It kind of creates a thread. It creates a language, perhaps. It creates a narrative, perhaps, and in that narrative, you're perhaps building an idea of something that's perhaps an illusion. I just want to kind of keep that.
Mm-hmm. You want to start? I don't know why I keep getting pounded with this question. Sorry, thank you for the question. But recently somebody asked me, they said, and Amy and I were just talking about this earlier, they said that my most visible projects have been a temporary pavilion and now a biennale. And they said that it is the work of fiction, and that I have expressed before a deep interest in working with fiction, that my teaching studio also leans heavily in speculative fiction. And they said, when are you going to make facts? And I am, just so everybody knows, very actively involved in making permanent built things at the moment that have stemmed directly from the methods of practice of these works of fiction. But I also think that to tread a line of what is fact and what is fiction is very tricky, and this is going to sound very philosophical, but I think everything we know is is also, we're a part of constructing that version of reality. The canon that I described around Islamic art that exists from 17th century France is very factual in the minds of so many people. And to be able to make a contribution to that is different is now also a fact, in a way. Without, I'm not saying this with regards to myself or what I did, but really the contributions of so many artists who did work with sound-based traditions that come from Islam, or with craft-led things that also come from practices of Islam. Artists who are thinking now about ecology and philosophies that come from the faith that are about lateral systems. These are now, I think, in the canon and also in their forms of practice, and they're going to be able to contribute something to how those people are making the future. When I worked on the Serpentine Pavilion, for example, one of the most important parts of the project was that there were these fragments placed across London in community arts institutions. And at that time, the method was described as a diasporic logic for making architecture. And people still said, what does that mean for a real permanent project? And now I had the opportunity recently to be working on a bridge project in Belgium. Our response to the brief is in honor of someone from history who I believe is really under-recognized. His name is Paul Panda Funana. And I won't talk about the whole story, but I just want to say that part of the project is also diasporic. So we're thinking about these dug-out boat structures. They're canoes, and the forms come from the Congo, where Funana was from. Each of them is planted with species that come from his horticultural research, because apart from being a hardcore Pan-Africanist who organized all these incredible conferences and changed the legal system, he also was a brilliant horticulturalist. And there's the main structure, but there are ancillary boat structures that will float along the river and embed themselves in different industrial zones, and then pollinate new ecologies and catalyze new relationships. And that is a method that my practice learned and grew on from working on the Serpentine Pavilion. So I think that this distinction that we have between fact and fiction is slippery in a really good way, and we should lean into that, I think. There are entirely new worlds waiting to happen, especially for architects. Everything we do is a constructed reality that didn't exist before.
No, I think you said I have nothing to add to that. No, quite the opposite. Quite the opposite.
Good. Right.
Thank you very much for these inspiring works. I was just wondering, while you were speaking, how you think of the audience while preparing your work, preparing your exhibition. Is the intention to firstly speak to your people or the group you are coming from or the group you are portraying, or do you think as well about how to speak on a universal language? I don't know if the question is clear, but that was my
I mean, I work in, well, if I do an exhibition, it's in a public space. I think about the public as the first aspect of all of this. And I take that very seriously, in that I try and think about what form of encounter does the public have with this work? Physically, how they're exploring the space, but also what happens when they see the works, and what do they understand, and how do they engage with that work? How might they see into the worldview of those artists? Yeah, these things, they can take a curiously long time, because you're trying to
sit within, imagine yourself into a number of different points of view. Think about the artist, think about the audience. Think ultimately about just what this arrangement of works can offer that hasn't existed before. Like, there has to be the reason to do a thing is not just because you can. It's because, to paraphrase Sumayya, you're trying to create a world that hasn't existed before, even if it's a very small, discrete world. But at the center of that is the experience of looking and viewing, of encounter. So yeah, that's right at the heart of all of that. And yeah, it's not a kind of top-down experience. It's really about, can you honor a visitor walking through the doors with something that is meaningful for them in that space?
So I think it's been a long and very fruitful day, and I want to thank both Ekow and Sumayya for sharing that world, or the worlds you've created that might not have previously existed with Felicity and me, and to thank Edward and Maxwell and Guang Yu for inviting us to this conversation, but also for curating a really impactful day. I don't know where next things are, but maybe you. Okay, so we're next up to 6:02 for some food and music. So thank you all. Thank you for your questions, and maybe we can continue upstairs.
Such a delight and an honor to be in conversation.
It's really, really a pleasure.
I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.